Hi, everyone. This is the Wellbeing Designers podcast. My name is Réka Deák. I am your host. In the first season of the podcast, we will meet the first generation of well-being leaders. They are the ones who are called head of well-being or similar in big organizations. Their responsibility is to navigate through the growing amount of well-being offerings to create value for employees by also keeping the executive leadership team engaged about the topic of well-being. They are proving that investing into well-being pays off and creates sustainable performance and business success. They are well-being designers. Hi, everyone. This is the fifth episode of the Wellbeing Designers podcast. Our guest today is Jake Sanders, the Global Wellbeing Initiatives Lead at PMI, which stands for Philip Morris International, an American multinational tobacco company employing 70,000 people with products sold over 180 countries worldwide. The company's legal seat is in Stamford, Connecticut in the US, while its operational headquarters are in Lausanne, Switzerland. With tobacco being addictive and the single greatest cause of preventable death globally, the company is highly controversial. Jake is a coach at heart that after realizing that professional football wasn't the industry he wanted to work in, took his passion for human performance and focused on how to implement behavior change in workplaces. Over the last 7 years, Jake has worked with companies in the UK and across the world on their well-being strategy, how to engage employees while designing workshops and interventions for these clients. Today, his work is focusing on how to bring about an environment of sustainable high performance where all are accountable for well-being. Welcome, Jake, to the Wellbeing Designers podcast.
Thank you very much, Reka. It's a lovely introduction.
We met through my podcast activities on LinkedIn. I will be very honest, I was a bit hesitant because of the profile of the company, tobacco. But when we had our first catch up, how you showed up and how you answered my challenging questions around the industry, that really made me think that I would invite you today. Welcome, and I am really looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Nice, thank you. So am I. It's funny, the feeling of not quite sure how to approach the conversation, because I can tell you that exactly the same thought process came through as I was interviewing at Philip Morris. It was a question that I was asked is, how do I feel about it? It's a really awesome environment to work in, when we have mass organizational change going on at the same time as really caring for people and our people, is that how we can really make an impact on them, which aligned really well with me, which I think is the same bit that you saw come through in our initial conversation. Is how do we really support people on a day-to-day basis, and how do we make that shift and that change for them?
How did you get into the world of organizational well-being?
You captured a little bit in your introduction around my initial journey in education and what I thought was going to be around my career. Was all focused on professional football. I wanted to be the best sports scientist in the world. It would probably be 16-year-old me would have told you. That's kind of how I made my decisions. I went to university. I studied human performance. I worked within 2 different football clubs here in the UK and realized that the environment of professional sport and the journey that was laid out ahead of me actually wasn't the romantic view of it that I had as a young child, and that I thought it could be. But I love coaching people. I love working with people, and that's the driver of how can I bring that change and how can I do that work. So I ran a studio where I live for a little bit in terms of how do we bring science-based behavior change to one-to-one coaching and small group coaching. And I had the opportunity around 7 years ago to start working with an insurance company to bring that idea of incentivized based coaching to large groups within organizations. So fixing the person and fixing the individual to working on larger scale systems of how can we engage large groups of people in health and wellbeing activity and self-care ultimately.
What do you know about the history of well-being at PMI and how it evolved, where you are, that you have dedicated positions?
Yeah, absolutely. I can talk a little bit around the history before me. In terms of how PMI views well-being, is it's part of our inclusion diversity strategy. So we have these kind of three core elements of inclusion diversity, which is around how we leverage talent diversity, how do we foster a culture of open dialogue, and how do we create this environment for sustainable high performance. And we can see that there are all elements of health and well-being and psychological safety play into those three key elements. It's a real commitment from the leadership at Philip Morris because as a team, we report into our Chief Diversity Officer. And then as a part of that wider inclusion diversity team, we have our wellbeing team. So I report into the global head of health and resilience, which is around really shaping the strategy around how we approach wellbeing at PMI and how do we review what's going on, because in over 90 countries we have office presence, we have a huge number of employees, so over 80,000, and that in itself, with different geographical challenges, cultural differences, all brings different challenges when it comes to well-being and different causes.
You are in an area where an employee already decided to join Philip Morris, so they know that they work for a company which doesn't necessarily sell products for the well-being of people. Based on your previous experience, do you see any difference between the employees working for PMI, how they approach health and well-being, and between other employees of other companies?
It's interesting because it's not different at all. For some people, that may be surprising, but in all my interactions and everything that I've seen, I'm fortunate enough that I get to spend more time actually looking into the whites of the eyes of people. And people all want the same thing, which is how do I have the time on a day-to-day basis to look after my health, but also to deliver on and feel purposeful in the work that I do and feel performance in the work that I do. Something which is not unique to Philip Morris, but something that we see across our employee base is that there is a desire for high performance.
So we can say that the average employee of your organization expecting the same in terms of well-being as other companies.
It's a really valid view to take. And one of the things that I really had to have a conversation with myself around in joining PMI was around the Unsmoke the World campaign. The biggest challenge to employee well-being at the moment that we have is this large organizational change going on, in the sense of the commitment that over 50% of revenue will come from non-tobacco product or non-combustible products by 2025, and that focus on shifting and almost cannibalizing your own customer base, of shifting them from a product that has well documented health impacts to one that is a reduced risk product. I think is a really challenging transformation to take part in.
What about COVID? That was before you joined the company. Did you hear about any shift in terms of the well-being approach?
So one of the outcomes of COVID was the smart work initiatives, which is our version of hybrid. But ultimately, what our employees told us is that effectively at 2 days a week in the office with their manager or their colleagues, that fosters the highest level of connection for them at work. So we didn't just choose policies based off of what we think looks good or what we need to look good. There is always a really data-led approach to not only what do people need, but what do people want. And then also reporting that data back, because I think with anything with well-being, trust is the biggest driver of bringing change about. And it's having trust between what you're sharing and what you're doing and how you communicate that. And I think the fact that we can do that, and that there is this culture of completing things like pulse surveys and then being told the results and what's shown, That work that had gone on previously has set a foundation that means it's incredibly powerful for us to be able to make decisions and to co-create within those spaces as well.
What kind of organizational challenges are you solving through Wellbeing? You mentioned the big transformation program that the company is going through. What else is there that you can really connect to metrics of the Wellbeing initiatives?
No, absolutely. So there are some areas that we really closely relate to well-being. The primary one is workload. But again, our people analytics have done some really, really impressive work around looking at workload. And rather than it just being that, okay, it's not just about people saying, okay, workload is the issue. It's okay, what is behind the workload? So what is contributing to the workload? Is it numbers of emails? Is it numbers of meetings? And what we found is that it's a sense of control. So it's from a cultural perspective of being able to say, communicating around deadlines. Is this deadline convenient? Is it not convenient? And this sense of control we see drives, when people don't feel like they have it, it then drives unhealthy behaviors. So things like not taking time off or not taking holiday. And then that in itself, we know drives lower well-being, drives lower performance, which can then increase the feeling or the loss of sense of control around workload. And we call this the vicious cycle. So a lot of the work that we're doing is around how to support employees to be able to target their workload and their sense of control. And a big element of that is flexibility and knowing that there is flexibility for all of us in our day-to-day. We work across different teams within that space so that we see the work that we do with our total reward team to bring benefits. And we talk about these moments that matter within that, as well as the overall focus for us, which is how do we develop this culture of self-care to then support the individuals. You can see it when people start talking about well-being from a supplier point of view as well, is that often all the well-being focus is on the individual employee and how to change or fix their health. And that is not something that we don't do, but we do look at it as a whole system. So each of us individually, we have a degree of responsibility for our health. If I sleep terribly, eat terribly, don't exercise, that's going to have an impact on the way that I show up to work. But at the same time, the environment at work also has to be conducive to positive well-being behavior. So the way that I kind of see how we work as a team is that we're there to ensure that there are the tools and the culture that an individual can take and do the actions that they need to do to look after their well-being, while also looking at the system that people exist within. So looking at how do our leadership show up from a well-being perspective? How are the ways of working in place to support that workload? And then how do we promote role modeling as the simplest of initiatives that we implemented this year, but I think is one of the most under talked about initiative that everybody has within well-being, which is annual leave. And taking time off for holidays. We've done a piece of work on really supporting role modeling on when people go on holiday. Don't take your phone, don't take your laptop, disconnect, switch off. I'm sure anyone listening to this in yourself, like we all know somebody who loves to work on holiday. That we know that people exist like that. But it's important to have people realize that that's an exception and not the rule. And to support people in how to make those positive decisions for their own health while having a system which encourages the positive decisions and provides the tool to do so.
I see the role of the leadership team really strongly because they can role model these behaviors. How much do you put emphasis on bottom-up versus top-down initiatives?
It's an equal measure. We have our employee resource groups. So that's across all areas of inclusion, diversity, and we have a specific focus on well-being within that space as well, which is where we can hear what's going on the ground and allow for employees the free space to be able to say this is the things that are impacting me on a day-to-day basis, which is where that kind of that bottom-up piece comes from. It's around listening and providing the resources to be able to give feedback. At the same time, by the fact that we have a chief diversity officer, we have a global head of health and resilience, there is a huge amount of work going into the structures, the policies, the processes we have as an organization, which can only be driven kind of top down in terms of the work that goes on in those spaces. So I say it's an equal measure in both ways. And we all know that when we look up to someone within an organization, if they exhibit a certain behavior, sometimes that can have more impact than any communications campaign, any app, any benefit. So that's kind of where we see is that really championing strong role modeling within healthy behaviors being a key driver for what we want to do.
Could you give us some insights about how they fit into the bigger structure? You said that's about also policies and processes, which is on the level of the head of health and resilience.
It can vary depending on the initiative. A really good one is around our champions programs. We have a centralized training, which is delivered by us as a team, but we have limitations within that because of language, the number of us that are involved in the team and the languages that we speak. Anything outside of that, we obviously couldn't serve employee bases for the languages that we don't speak. And time zone becomes a challenge when you have team from one side of the world all the way to the other. So we then work directly with markets through things like train the trainer. So rather than us try and implement the initiative ourselves, we'll work directly with the relevant market, work with them on how to implement it locally, how to translate it, what kind of process to go through, and then support that local deployment. So although it's a global initiative, it's very much everything we do needs to be delivered locally.
What does the Champions program cover? What elements of well-being?
It has a focus within mental health and being able to spot signs and signpost to care. But the real driver of it at its core is how to work within the circle of influence within the organization that you work within. The primary focus of the champions is to be a mouthpiece for sustainable high performance, being a mouthpiece for the initiatives that are being run, but not necessarily to do that for the whole organization, but to look at their immediate circle of influence within the organization. It's a really important thing of providing them with the tools to be able to demonstrate. It's another area of role modeling. So it's different ways in which we can bring role modeling, and it's not necessarily their leader, but it's someone within a team or someone within an organization. And I believe that's how we can start to create cultural shifts across PMI.
How is the ratio between office and non-office workers at PMI? How do you address that?
We obviously have three kind of key groups in the terms of we have office-based, we have those in factories, and we have those actually picking tobacco leaf as an example. They all have unique challenges around health and association. Obviously, when you start looking outside of the office, there is a larger emphasis on we call it security and market safety. So our kind of HSE teams, and process and policy becomes obviously more driven into day-to-day life. So at the moment, we're talking about how can we support line manager training, specifically in manufacturing environments, because in manufacturing, you don't necessarily have the same working structures as you would do in an office to have interactions and maybe those one-to-one connections to check in with your own team. So we're doing work on how can we empower and equip managers to be able to have that as part of the structure and process within their day, because that's their normal day-to-day process. How can we, rather than adding layers on top of what they do, how can we embed it into things that they're already doing? Which I think is the primary difference between when we look at our office-based and our non-office-based employees, is that at office-based, it's you can be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more free, whereas with those that are not in the office, it's about embedding it into the processes they do on a day-to-day basis. And within that, equips that gives people more time, because that's the biggest currency we can give back to employees is time to engage with wellbeing.
Going back a bit to this split between office, factory, and picking the tobacco, uh, do I understand well that this champions program goes across these three groups, or is it something specific only for one group?
So it's across all three groups. So we have delivered train the training into all three areas. So it is something that is growing, and we're monitoring now, and we're starting to go into the second phase of how is it being received, and what can we do to improve around the Champions program in non-office environments, because there is a slightly different challenge there. But that's the project for 2023 and 2024.
Is there any other program that you would highlight and mention that belongs to this structure that you work on?
We're looking at how we can really support markets drive their own well-being, and how they can kind of start to benchmark against the rest of the world of PMI, and how they can leverage the tools that we have. So at the moment, we're kind of developing in-house a maturity assessment on how to really assess the offering, and how mature the well-being is within the local organization, and then to outline action plans for them to implement locally around how to improve that. So it's not necessarily that they have to do every initiative or implement every initiative that we have available globally, but it's how they can personalize and make something unique to the market, which makes sense to their people, but also delivers on what they're expecting from a well-being perspective, and lean on the huge wealth of resource that we have in terms of people's knowledge within the organization.
You are below the chief diversity officer, which already shows a commitment from the company that they have such a position as a chief level. Did you face any challenges, how you keep the leadership team engaged in terms of these well-being initiatives?
Because I'm going to caveat this with it, that I've been at PMI for just short of a year. But what I've been aware of so far while I've been here is that there is a huge appetite for making change, and there's a huge appetite for supporting the agenda around us being a more inclusive and diverse workforce that is open for all and has open dialogue for all. And that extends into each piece of work that's going on. The leadership have been really involved in that.
You mentioned pulse surveys, and before the maturity assessment plus the employee satisfaction survey, is there anything else in terms of metrics that you use for the work?
Within those surveys, there are lots of different pieces that drive metrics. We're a big believer in an EMPS as a driver, both looking at well-being and engagement. We did a well-being focus survey in 2021. We're at the moment of reviewing and doing another one as part of the work for the maturity assessment. But the work there was really looking what are the pieces that impact well-being for us overall. And we're now looking at other data sources and what could we utilize. The challenge always comes with data is how much of it is opt-in and how much of it is opt-out for employees. And we're currently in the process of having Microsoft Viva being implemented for parts of the business. And that will start to open up the possibility with some data analytics about how people interact with each other. So we're just exploring what could be done. And I think we're in this fun stage of looking at what's possible, what could we analyze, what would be the use of it.
I remember a Harvard Business Review article a few years ago, which clearly stated that all employee well-being programs, interventions should be opt-out. So everyone should be assigned to it. We just shouldn't waste energy on opting in people like that, we give them the opportunity, because then they might just for some reason not sign up, and it's a waste of effort from our side designing it.
Yeah, engagement is always the biggest piece when you start to look at well-being. When you look at from a perspective of workload, leadership behaviors, processes, policies, none of that involves an employee needing to opt in. So there's huge amounts that can be done in that space. And if the focus is how do we give employees more time back, then that caters for it a lot more. I do think that often one of the things that you see is that it's really hard to grab employees' attention outside of their immediate work product. People. It's where I'm a big believer that the reward is a powerful driver. Part of my work at university was looking at incentivizing participation in wellness, and it's been a common theme through the work over the last 7 years is that when you add incentives, there is a big drive in engagement. The analogy of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Goes back to that piece of often when we look at well-being, it's how can we fix the individual? It's all we can do is provide the tools and the incentive for someone to engage. We've got to create a compelling story to the individual of why taking part in well-being for them is important. But they still have to take that final step.
And we have to fight with the time, right? Because that's, as you mentioned, the biggest competitor of everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Talking about time, we also have limited time left for this podcast. So I would have 2 last questions for you. What is your advice for future well-being leaders in a similar role that you are doing now?
It's a great question. It's prioritize how you can hand as much time back to employees as possible. Provide simple tools for them to engage in, and create a compelling story from leadership to demonstrate positive well-being behavior.
And what about you? How do you keep up with this busy work that you are doing at PMI? What do you do for your own well-being?
I do role model really well, and I practice what I preach massively. The first thing is around self-awareness, and it's finding as much self-awareness of keeping where you are in check, and that's both from an emotional level and a physical level. So I am a big believer in getting a health check as much as you can. So I go and have a blood test twice a year. And then in terms of emotional, I think being aware of your own emotional regulation can have the biggest impact on your life moving forward, because how you interact with people at work, it's how you interact with people in your social life, and being able to communicate those boundaries. And for me, I didn't realize that I struggled with that until lockdown and the impacts of lockdown, and I didn't know what was going on with me. So I'm a big believer in having some counseling and talking through those kind of things. So they're my 2, I'll champion them all the time to people. And the final thing is, and I think it's really cool, is talk about finding your third space. And I mean, there's a really clever gym group in the UK which is called Third Space, which their whole marketing is your home is your first space, work is your second space, their gym is your third space. But I think finding your third space is really important, because it's that third thing which motivates you outside of your immediate home and work life. For me, that just happens to be full activity. So I've found a real love of exploring, hiking, doing ultra marathons, doing fitness competitions that have different kinds of physical challenges. And I know that for other people, it might be something completely different. And I think that's what makes humans really interesting and really cool at the same time.
I can relate to everything what you said. And thanks for mentioning the health check. Sometimes I think we forget about this very basic thing to take care of health. Thanks a lot, Jake, and good luck with all the initiatives. Maybe in the future we can do another check-in, how everything is going, and looking forward to following your journey.
Thank you very much for the time, Reka.
I hope that you enjoyed this episode of the Wellbeing Designers podcast. Let's design the future of well-being together. To join the movement of the Wellbeing Designers, reach out to me via LinkedIn or email hello@rekadeak.com. REKADEAK. I am keen to hear about your stories, your ideas, and your feedback. Together, we can design the future of well-being and make workplaces fit for humans.